I'm here at a market in Mexico, and this sweet potato may be evidence that Polynesians reached the Americas before Columbus. Now, the sweet potato is from the Americas, but people were already growing it on Pacific Islands before 1492. So how did this get across the world's largest ocean? And this isn't just about sweet potatoes. DNA shows that Polynesians and Americans met long before Europeans arrived. There's even another DNA story in the Amazon that some people say is Polynesian, and I get into that too. Buenos dias. The Vikings left behind evidence of a settlement in the Americas. If Polynesians got here too, they left behind a very different type of evidence. A crop, a word, and DNA. There's a serious case Polynesians reached the Americas before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But as we do around here, we'll make the case for, the case against, and then you make the call. Let's get to the evidence. The first clue is the sweet potato, and no, it wasn't just a prop. In 1991, archaeobotanist John Hather and archaeologist Patrick Kirch reported finding charred remains of sweet potato at Tangatatao rock shelter on Mangaya, a small island in the Cook Islands in eastern Polynesia. And the archaeological layer containing them is dated between the years 1361 and 1466. That means the sweet potato was present on Mangaya when Columbus reached the Americas in 1492. And botanists are certain the sweet potato originated in the Americas. In 2013, French researcher Caroline Roulier and her colleagues compared DNA from sweet potatoes collected across Polynesia with varieties from the Americas. Their results supported a transfer from the region around present-day Peru and Ecuador into Polynesia before European contact, and it looks like they carried its name with them, too. The Maori word for sweet potato is Kumara. On Rapa Nui, which you may know as Easter Island, it's Kumara. Linguists Willem Adelaar and Peter Moiskin compared these words with similar names for the crop recorded in South America, including Kumar and Kumara. Their work supports the idea that Polynesian navigators reached America and carried both the plant and a version of its name back to Polynesia, where they spread out the name, changing a little bit as it moved along. But it's not just one or two words. As you see here, it's words that run the gamut from Kumara or Kumara to Kumala, Umara, Kuman, coming from similar words from the American continent. As far as I know, a couple of words is a similarity or coincidence. But all of these? Now, Polynesians had already settled islands across a large area of the Pacific Ocean, reaching Hawaii in the north, Aotearoa or New Zealand in the southwest, and Rapa Nui in the east. Rapa Nui is only 14 miles long, yet Polynesian navigators found and settled it more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. And that navigational mastery wasn't a one-time thing. In 1976, Mau Piailug, a master navigator from Micronesia, guided the double-hulled canoe Hōkūleʻa more than 2,500 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti without modern navigational instruments. He read the stars, winds, and ocean swells, using knowledge passed down between generations. That voyage showed that indigenous Pacific navigators could intentionally cross thousands of miles of open ocean and reach a planned destination. And if we go to Rapa Nui oral traditions, they also talk about very long intentional voyages. In the story of Hotumatua, scouts were sent to find the island of Rapa Nui before their larger settlement voyage. Other traditions remember navigators sailing about 250 miles east to Motu Motiro Hiva, now Salas y Gomez Island, to collect seabirds and feathers, and then returning home. These weren't stories about people just simply drifting across the Pacific. They describe people setting out for distant islands and knowing how to return. Want more evidence? Well, there's actually a sign that Polynesians may have reached the coast of Chile. In 2007, archaeologist Alice Story and an international team reported chicken bones from El Arenal, a pre-Columbian archaeological site in south-central Chile. Their DNA matched a sequence found in ancient Polynesian chickens, and radiocarbon dating placed the bones between about the years 1320 and 1400. Because voyagers may have carried chickens as they settled the Pacific, Story and her colleagues concluded that Polynesians must have brought these chickens to the coast of Chile before Europeans arrived. But the strongest evidence of contact between Polynesians and indigenous Americans doesn't come from a sweet potato or a chicken bone. It comes from DNA. In 2020, computational geneticist Alexander Ioannidis, Mexican geneticist Dr. Andrés Moreno Estrada, and an international team published the results of a major DNA study in Nature. They used DNA from 807 people, representing 17 Polynesian island populations and 15 indigenous communities along the Pacific coast of the Americas. They found indigenous American ancestry among people from several eastern Polynesian islands and placed the earliest contact at around the year 1200. Among the indigenous American communities included in the study, the closest genetic connection was with the Zenú of present-day Colombia. This led researchers to trace the source of the indigenous American ancestry to that region. Now, the earliest signs of that ancestry in Polynesia appeared among people from the southern Marquesas Islands. It later appeared on other islands, like Rapa Nui. Putting those findings together, the researchers favored the idea that Polynesian navigators reached the coast of present-day Colombia, where Polynesian and indigenous American people met and had children. Some of the people with that shared ancestry then sailed back to Polynesia. Then in 2024, another team studied the genomes of 15 Rapa Nui ancestors whose remains had been held in a museum in France. The researchers found that about 10% of their ancestry came from indigenous Americans. They placed the meeting between the populations sometime between the years 1250 and 1430. Together, the 2020 and 24 studies showed that Polynesian and indigenous American people met and had children before Columbus reached the Americas. A Polynesian voyage to the Americas and back could connect everything found so far. An American crop in Polynesia, a related name on both sides of the Pacific, possible Polynesian chickens in Chile, and indigenous American ancestry carried home to eastern Polynesia. Looks pretty much like a slam dunk as far as Polynesians being in the Americas, right? Well, there are some problems with these theories. Now, the strongest evidence in the case for is DNA. But can DNA tell us where the meeting happened or who crossed the ocean? Not necessarily. The meeting could have happened on the coast of South America, on the island of Rapa Nui, or another island or somewhere else in the Pacific. The 2024 study supports contact across the Pacific, but it can't tell us which population made the voyage or if there was more than one. There's also uncertainty about the apparent connection with Colombia. The 2020 study found its closest available match among the Zenú, but genetic information from the different indigenous communities along the Pacific coast is limited. The Zenú were the closest match among the communities available to the researchers. It doesn't prove that Polynesians landed in Zenú territory or even that the meeting happened in what is now Colombia. And the genetic dates also come with limits. Neither study could directly date the first meeting. The 2020 team used DNA from people living today, while the 2024 study used DNA from 15 Rapa Nui ancestors who lived centuries later. In both cases, researchers worked backwards, using how inherited sections of DNA change over generations to estimate when populations had children together. The 2024 study placed that meeting between 1250 and 1430. Both studies point to contact before Europeans arrived, but neither gives us the exact place where it happened or who crossed the Pacific in what direction. What if South Americans moved west? South American coastal societies built seaworthy vessels and maintained trade routes along the Pacific coast. A westward voyage could have been deliberate, accidental, or even started as one and ended up as the other. There's even one account of an Inca ruler sailing west into the Pacific. Spanish chroniclers recorded an Andean tradition that the Inca ruler Tupac Yupanqui sailed west from the coast of present-day Ecuador. According to the account, he visited two distant islands called Ahuachumbi and Ninachumbi and then returned. Unfortunately, we don't know where those islands were or how much the story has changed over time. But if it was a real voyage, it supports the possibility that South Americans were also capable of carrying people, crops, and words west. But can winds and currents carry a boat that far west from the coast? In November 2012, Salvadoran fisherman José Salvador Alvarenga left the Pacific coast of Mexico for a short fishing trip. His engine died, and winds and currents carried him west for 438 days. He eventually reached the Ebon Atoll in the Marshall Islands, about 6,700 miles away. Ocean researchers reconstructed his journey and showed that yes, winds and currents could have taken his boat remarkably close to where he was found. Now, Alvarenga wasn't recreating an ancient voyage, but his ordeal showed that an unplanned western crossing of the Pacific isn't a hypothetical. Now, a deliberate westward voyage was demonstrated in 1947, when Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition sailed a balsa raft from Peru into Polynesia. Heyerdahl wanted to support a much larger claim that South Americans had a big part in settling Polynesia. Now, Heyerdahl didn't prove his larger settlement theory, but the Kon-Tiki expedition did prove that you could take a balsa raft and go very far distances to the west from South America. And that leaves open the possibility that South Americans reached Polynesia and carried their DNA, the sweet potato, or both with them. But even the sweet potato evidence has limits. The carbonized sweet potato remains from Mangaya were not directly carbon dated. Why, you ask? Because they were microscopic pieces of charred tissue, and dating them would have destroyed them. Instead, Hather and Kirch dated unidentified charcoal from the surrounding archaeological layers. This can be common in dating sensitive organic materials. Later work placed the remains between the years 1361 and 1466, still before Columbus, but much later than the original estimates say. And there's another possibility. Perhaps people didn't carry the sweet potato across the Pacific. In 2018, botanist Pablo Muñoz Rodriguez and his colleagues studied DNA from a sweet potato collected in Polynesia in 1769. Their results suggested that this Polynesian sweet potato's ancestors had split from its American relatives long before people settled Polynesia, raising the possibility that the plant reached the islands naturally. But other researchers disagreed. They argued that when two plant lineages split doesn't tell us when one crossed the ocean. People still could have carried it much later. Confused yet? I was. The important thing is that researchers still don't agree on how the sweet potato crossed the Pacific. So as interesting as it is, the sweet potato alone can't establish that Polynesian people reached the Americas. The language connection is also disputed. The Polynesian words Kumala and Kumara resemble names recorded in South America for the same crop. But there is a possibility, even if it's a small one, for words to resemble each other by coincidence. I get into how languages can have accidental similarities in the videos that I did about the words Michigan and Michoacán, and you can check that one out after this video. And that video definitely hit a nerve. The Chilean chickens face an even stronger objection. In 2008, a team led by Chilean researcher Jaime Góngora reached a different conclusion from Alice Story's team. Their work connected Chilean chickens with European and Asian sources. And what about the DNA connection that I mentioned between Polynesia and the Amazon at the beginning of the video? In 2015, geneticists found that certain people from the Brazilian Amazon, including the Suruí and Caritiana, share a small part of their distant ancestry with people from Australia and New Guinea. That connection is sometimes described as Polynesian DNA in the Amazon, but that's not exactly what researchers found. The connection is Australasian, not specifically Polynesian. Researchers generally associate it with migrations into the Americas thousands of years before the contact is discussed in this video. Now, the much older Australasian connection, that deserves a video of its own, because it might belong to an earlier chapter of the peopling of the Americas. And if you want that video, let me know in the comments below and I'll get to work. Then there are two skulls from a Brazilian museum collection that were labeled botocudo. Genetic work published in 2013 and 2014 found that those two individuals had Polynesian ancestry and no detectable Indigenous American ancestry. That sounds like direct evidence of Polynesians in Brazil. But the skulls came from a 19th century museum collection. Researchers can't establish who the individuals were when they reached Brazil or how they got there. They could have arrived through movement that occurred after Europeans began crossing the Pacific. Now, both Brazilian discoveries are real, but neither conclusively proves that Polynesians came to the Amazon before Columbus. And the largest gap, it belongs to the American mainland. Archaeologists haven't found an uncontested Polynesian settlement, canoe, dwelling, or collection of tools in a securely dated pre-Columbian site in South America. And that is the major difference between the Polynesian case and the Vikings. At Lance All Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists found the physical remains of a Norse settlement dating to the year 1000 AD. For the Polynesian case, we have strong evidence that the two populations met, but we don't have the smoking gun of a location that says Polynesians stood here. The old question was whether Polynesian and Indigenous American people had contact before the arrival of Columbus. According to the genetic studies, the answer is yes. They met and had children before Europeans reached the region. The harder question is the one in the title. Did Polynesian navigators reach the Americas before Columbus? There's a real case they did, but there's one thing missing: the place where they landed. And we still don't know which way that first voyage went. Now, the sweet potato we've been talking about might point to a previous voyage, but it doesn't guarantee one. So did Polynesians sail east and then return home? Did Indigenous South Americans sail west? Or were people crossing in both directions? I want to hear your opinion in the comments. And if you have sources, let us know about them. I'm posting mine in the description so you can also do your own homework. And if you want to continue exploring how people reached and moved through the Americas, I strongly recommend my video about Monte Verde, an archaeological site in Chile that changed the accepted timeline for the peopling of the Americas by thousands of years. And I invite you to join the channel for more myths, legends, history, and unsolved mysteries of the Americas. And to check out the description, like I said before, for resources and access to the ancient Eñe t-shirt collection and more related to the stories that I tell. Mil gracias for watching, friend. And until the next video, I'm Andrew. Adios.
Hola amigo, ¿qué buscaba?